Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Season 5 of the Islamic History Podcast. During this season, we will be discussing World War I from the Ottoman perspective. More than any of those wars, World War I has impacted us as Muslims more than anything else. World War I is so important because it led to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. It led to European colonization of the Middle East, but most importantly, it set the stage for the creation of the State of Israel. It wasn't necessarily the war in 1948 that led to the creation of the State of Israel. It was what happened during World War I and in the aftermath of World War I that led to that. So inshallah, during these next several episodes, it's going to take quite a while to get through everything. We're going to discuss World War I, the political aspects of it, the thinking of the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, and the thinking of the various leaders of different empires and different belligerents and people who were nations who were involved in World War I. We're going to look at all of that, but most of this is going to be coming from the Ottoman perspective. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the fighting in Europe. I will have to discuss it because there was a good deal of fighting in Europe, and often events in Europe had an impact on events in the Ottoman Empire and in the Middle East. But for the most part, we're going to focus on the fighting in the Middle East, or at least the fighting that the Ottoman Empire was involved in, because they weren't always, all the fighting wasn't in the Middle East, though most of it was. So this is going to be a very important season, inshallah, and I hope you learn a lot from it. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We'll begin by discussing the last days of old Europe. In the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, you can call this the last days of old Europe, because the old way of Europe, the feudal states and the pageantry and our story starts in the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, where the European powers have come to the conclusion that the Ottoman Empire, which is crumbling right now, isn't really going to last very long. Most European nations assumed that they would eventually take over the lands of the Ottoman Empire, but they weren't really in a hurry to do so. Now, they were bullying the Ottomans around, and we'll talk about that in a few moments, but they weren't really concerned about necessarily grabbing parts of the Middle East just yet. That would come, but not just yet. Most of what we now call the Middle East, particularly the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, North Africa, a little bit of Asia, and of course, Anatolia, which is now the Republic of Turkey. Most of the modern Middle East was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Middle East was not really on the radar of the European powers at this time because it was not part of the so-called Great Game. The Great Game was a period of political and military maneuvers and schemes and actions between Great Britain, France, and Russia, with all three of these powers vying for global dominance. At this point of time, just before the beginning of World War I, none of these three powers were particularly concerned about the Middle East. So let's talk a little bit about the history of this so-called Great Game. The Great Game, as it took place in Asia, began around the 15th and 16th centuries when European explorers began looking for overseas colonies, particularly in Asia. Britain's most important colony at this time, in the early 1900s, where our story begins in World War I, or the eve of World War I, Britain's most important colony was India, and that was considered the empire, that is the British Empire's crown jewel. So much of what Great Britain did at that time was to protect India, which they were extracting humongous amounts of wealth from. So in order to protect India from rivals such as France and Russia, Great Britain often propped up weak and sometimes despotic rulers around the world, but also in the Middle East, as a way of as sort of like a buffer between India and these other powers, Russia and Great Britain. The Ottoman Empire often benefited from Great Britain propping up these weak rulers. So actually, the Ottoman Empire was a bit of a bulwark or a buffer between India and these other great powers, between India and Russia and France. Great Britain did not want the Ottoman Empire to fall because they didn't want Russia or France having that easy access to India in case the Ottoman Empire did fall. If the Ottoman Empire fell, that would make it very easy for France or Russia to take over the Middle East and be that much closer to India. By 1880, however, the British public was starting to get upset with the Ottoman Empire. And this is where we have to try to comb through the propaganda a little bit, but there was lots of propaganda against the Ottomans during this period of time, and there is now today, not against the Ottomans, but against Muslims in general. And the propaganda in Great Britain and throughout much of the European Christian world was that the Ottoman Empire was persecuting its religious minorities, particularly Christians. We hear this today when Muslims are often accused of persecuting Christians or persecuting Christian minorities or persecuting sometimes Hindu minorities, whatever the case may be. We hear the same propaganda today, even though Muslims often face not just persecution, but even genocide or attempted genocide when they are the minority, or sometimes even when they're not the minority. Muslims often face persecution, genocide, and outright slaughter, and it's condemned, but people don't really go to war for it. So during this period of time, in the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was having problems with some of its minorities, some of its ethnic and religious minorities, particularly the Armenians. I won't go into the details of what happened between the Ottomans and the Armenians just yet. We will talk about that later on in this season. But suffice it to say, the Ottomans were accused of massacring and attacking the Armenian population within their borders, particularly within Anatolia. There's no question about whether the Ottomans did attack and kill many Armenians. We're talking about before World War I, not the events that took place during World War I, what is often labeled as the Armenian genocide. What happened before World War I, there were attacks. I don't want to say attacks. There were times when the Ottoman Empire cracked down on the Armenian community. The Ottoman Empire was in a great rivalry with Russia at this time. This was before Russia became communist. And the Russians often used the Armenians as their foil or as their scapegoat, as their reason to start a war with the Ottoman Empire. And with the Ottoman Empire being very weak, it would give the Russians an opportunity to snatch more land away from the Ottomans. And so they often used the Armenians to rile things up and to get things started, or to maybe not necessarily start a revolution or start a rebellion, but do something to cause the Ottoman government to crack down on the Armenians. Anyway, the British public was angry with the Ottoman Empire for its treatment of religious minorities, particularly Christian Armenians, and the British public began to clamor and force its government to withdraw its support for the Ottoman Empire. So Great Britain withdrew its support from the Ottoman Empire after one of these crackdowns by the Ottomans against the Armenians. From the Ottoman perspective, they were snuffing out a rebellion. They were squelching a revolt. From the Armenian perspective, they were being attacked by a despotic government. So with Great Britain no longer propping up the Ottoman government against the Russians, the Ottomans had to turn to a new European power, a new rising European power for support, and that turned out to be the German Empire. And as things turns out, it really wasn't the Russians that the British had to worry about. It was really the Germans. The Russians were really not that powerful. It had a great landmass and a large population, but its government, before the rise of communism, the Russian Tsar was incompetent, and the Russian government was in shambles, and people were starving, even though they had massive natural resources and a whole lot of, it's more than sufficient food for its people. It grew enough food for its people, but didn't have the logistics to transport that food throughout its vast territory. So Russia was really nowhere near the problem that Great Britain thought it was. It was really the Germans. Once Great Britain realized that Russia really wasn't a big deal, they now shifted their focus to a new boogeyman, and that was now the Germans. So just as Great Britain had done when they were in a rivalry against Russia, they now began to do the same thing with Germany. They began to form strategic alliances to counter Germany. Russia was exposed in 1905 when they were defeated by Japan. Once Russia, which was this great power, was defeated by this small Asian nation that was just a few islands that had just become industrialized a few decades earlier, once Russia was defeated by Japan, everybody knew that Russia was not anything they had to worry about. And that's what made Great Britain realize that they had been worrying about the wrong country. It was Germany that they had to be concerned about. So with that defeat in 1905 by Japan, Russia and Great Britain signed a treaty in 1907 that effectively ended the great game and the rivalry between Great Britain and Russia. So that's how things stood in Europe between Great Britain, Russia, Germany, and even the Ottoman Empire. But let's now switch our view to the Middle East. Let's look at how the Middle East was before the war started. As we mentioned, the Ottoman Empire was already well on its way in decline by 1914. 1914 is the year that World War I began. It had already earned the name of the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire came into being about 1,000 years before World War I, when nomadic horsemen from the steppes of Asia conquered much of what we now call Anatolia. These horse warriors were originally pagan, which we discussed extensively in our series on the Umayyad Caliphate. They were initially pagan, their ancestors were pagan, but their ancestors had converted to Islam. So by the time these horse warriors from the Asian steppes are now coming into Anatolia, they had been Muslim for hundreds of years by this time. So a warlord named Osman in the 13th century established what would become the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia in what is now modern Turkey. By the 15th century, the Ottomans had conquered the Byzantine Empire, most of Arabia, North Africa, and the Balkans. Now the Ottomans were great warriors. During this early time of Ottoman expansion, the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, even part of the 16th century, the Ottomans were great warriors. They had a magnificent military machine, lots of pageantry, many successes, but the problem is they often had ineffective rulers. We find this also with other Muslim empires, great empires like the Umayyads, the Abbasids to a certain extent, but definitely the Umayyads. The only way they knew how to rule was to keep on expanding. They didn't know how to expand their borders except to keep on conquering. Conquer more lands, bring in more wealth by conquering more lands. Eventually, however, the Ottomans ran their course, just like the Umayyads and every other empire runs its course when it tries to conquer and conquer and conquer. Eventually, they run their course and they would meet up with an empire or another land that could effectively defend itself. And once this great empire, we see this with Great Britain, we see this with the Ottomans, we saw this with the Umayyads, once that land can no longer expand, once that empire, can no longer expand, it begins to shrink. According to some analysts, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with all this, but according to some analysts, the Ottomans did not really have a good framework for maintaining and governing their diverse empire. Most nations do not. All right. Most nations do not have a really good way of governing an empire made up or a land made up of multiple different ethnic groups. So this is not something that's unique to the Ottomans. When people come together or have to try to share power and they are many different ethnic groups and diverse and very starkly different ethnic groups, there will often be problems. We see how it is in the United States with so many ethnic groups and so many things done based upon characteristics, based upon race, based upon ethnicity. The Ottoman Empire was a theocracy and it ruled by Islam. Islam was the law of the land, and the emperor, the sultan or the sultan, was the caliph of Islam. The Ottoman sultan was the caliph of Islam. Now, the Ottomans' Shiite subjects did not necessarily share or agree with all of these claims, but they were a minority group as far as religion. They were a minority religious group, and they had to live under the auspices and under the rulership of the Ottoman Empire. The main thing that was holding the Ottoman Empire together was Islam. That was the main thing that held all of these various different ethnic groups of Turks and Arabs and Africans and Europeans and Balkans and and Persians and many other different groups. The thing that held all of these groups together was Islam. But at the same time, roughly 25% of the Ottoman Empire was Christian, and many of them did not really want to be ruled by Muslims. At this point of time, nationalism was a big thing. Earlier, if you go back maybe 200 years before World War I, it would not have been a big deal for any religious minority, so long as they're not being persecuted. They would not have minded so much being ruled by another religion, so long as they're not persecuted or oppressed. And there wasn't much, as far as I could read, as far as I found out, there wasn't many movements. There were freedom movements, or I'll say independence movements, definitely. But most of these came really during the 1800s. But these things weren't always based on religion. They were usually based upon, well, the Ottomans conquered our kingdom 100 years ago, and we want to break free and reestablish our original kingdom, things like that. But now with nationalism rising up, and we'll talk about nationalism later on in the series, but with nationalism becoming a big deal, you have many groups of people within the Ottoman Empire who were not Muslim, not wanting to be ruled by Muslims any longer. We mentioned how the Ottoman Empire had many different ethnic groups. We mentioned Turks, Arabs, we mentioned Europeans, but particularly Greeks. We, of course, mentioned Armenians in the beginning. There were Jews also. With all these different groups of people, they almost certainly did not speak the same language, and they definitely didn't share the same culture, and sometimes they didn't even like each other. You have many different groups, and no, not necessarily Arabs and Jews, but there are many different groups that were historic rivals. Then they got conquered by the Ottomans, and now they got to figure out a way to live together. The only thing they have in common is that they probably don't like being ruled by the Ottomans. But the Ottoman government was, at this point in time now, it was really too fractured and weak to really establish a good administration. We're going to get into that in just a moment. The Ottomans had something called a Vilayet system, which comes from the Arabic word wilaya. This is basically where the various parts of their empire were divided into administrative divisions, and they were often ruled by a local person from that ethnic group. So if you have this area of the empire where the vast majority of the people are Greek or maybe Armenian, it will be ruled by a Greek or Armenian, usually a religious leader, like a patriarch or something like that. It will be ruled by a religious leader from that group, but that leader will be, of course, answerable to the Ottoman Empire. That leader, he would get his paycheck and his position and whatever authority he had, it will come from the Sultan, from the Ottoman Empire. But they ruled, essentially, the patriarch or whoever ruled the local area, ruled that vilayet, that was part of a different ethnic group or different religious group or minority group of some sort. Not ethnic group. That religious minority would be ruled by a local governor, but from that religious minority. So a Greek Orthodox region will be ruled by a Greek Orthodox official. They will have a lot of freedom, a lot of independence, a lot of autonomy. So long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause trouble with the Sultan, they kind of had a lot of independence. And the Ottoman Empire didn't infringe on their religious freedoms and a lot of other things. They did have to pay taxes. They did have to do that, but they often did not have to serve in the army. That's another story. So basically, the Ottoman Empire did not really have a strong central government that controlled these many different ethnic groups. They let them kind of run themselves so long as they pay their taxes back to the emperor or to the sultan. The government did have control over the large cities of the empire, like Damascus and Istanbul, no matter what was a majority there. If it was a large city, a large important city, the Ottoman Empire generally held direct control over that one. But other than that, outside of the large cities, it was generally local like the local patriarchs that I mentioned, chieftains, warlords. They're the ones who ran the local regions, even in the Muslim area, so long as they were answerable to the Ottoman Sultan. This, of course, without a lot of these leaders being traditional bureaucrats, traditional government employees. Instead, they were just guys who somehow rose to power and then claimed that I'm ruling this land in the name of the Ottoman Empire, or I'm in the name of the Ottoman Sultan. The Sultan would recognize him and let him rule. That happened in many different parts of the Muslim world, especially as well. So this often led to a lot of chaos within the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, the 1800s, the Ottomans were trying to bring some reforms in, but many analysts around the world at that time saw that by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was trying to bring in some reforms to try to bring this chaos under some control. By the late 1800s, the other European powers had already begun infringing on Ottoman territory and Ottoman sovereignty. For instance, Egypt. Egypt was nominally under Turkish rule, but it had been occupied by Great Britain. We will explain that later on in the series, how that happened. But that's what we have here. We have Egypt, technically on paper, as part of the Ottoman Empire, in words and deed, but it was being directly governed by Great Britain, and they were doing whatever they wanted to do in there. So that's the kind of weakness that the Ottoman Empire had. Another example of this infringement on Ottoman sovereignty was France and Russia. Both of these groups had claimed the right to protect individuals or Ottoman subjects from their particular religious group. So the French claimed the right to protect Catholic subjects of the Ottoman Empire. So if France believed that the Ottoman Empire was persecuting Catholics, France gave itself the right to invade and attack the Ottoman Empire to stop that perceived persecution. Russia did the same thing for Orthodox Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They could intervene if they wanted to. Istanbul, let's talk about that for a bit. Istanbul, formerly known as Constantinople. Constantinople was the original name of the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople was captured by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, where it became known as Istanbul. And Istanbul served as the Ottoman capital for the next 400 years, up until it became a republic after World War I, which again, that will come later, inshallah. Constantinople became officially known as Istanbul in 1930, which actually took place well after World War I. But Istanbul was called Istanbul by most Muslims and also by the Turks running the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans themselves, they called it Istanbul the whole time, but lots of Europeans continued to call it Constantinople. Might have been in some form of disrespect, who knows, but the fact is that outside of the Ottoman Empire, Europeans still continued to call Istanbul Constantinople until 1930, when the name was officially changed. Now, Istanbul is really a collection of towns on the European side of the Bosporus. That in the Bosporus Strait is a strip of water that separates Europe from Asia. The thing about Istanbul is that this location makes it very difficult to invade and very easy to defend. The Muslim world has been invading Constantinople since the time of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. Okay, we're talking about since the time of the first generation of Muslims. They've been trying to invade Constantinople. It had been very difficult to capture until it was finally captured by the Ottomans in 1453. We'll discuss that in our series on the Bosnian War, inshallah. Right before World War I started, when our story begins, in this early part of the 20th century, Istanbul was a melting pot of different ethnicities and religions. It was one of the largest cities in the world. There were also a large minority of European foreigners living in Istanbul, and they mostly congregated in a place called Pera, a neighborhood called Pera within Istanbul, and that's where all of the European embassies were. Things that even though Istanbul was the Ottoman capital, even though it was an extremely large city, even though it was a very important city culturally, financially, geographically, it was still well behind the other European capitals. Here's something to put it in perspective. Istanbul only started using electric lights in 1912. New York City had electric lights in 1884. Right? That's almost 40 years earlier. Most of the streets of Istanbul before World War I were still unpaved. It was known to have poor sewage and a very poor drainage system. So you can see that this perspective shows just how, at least technologically speaking, and technology is not everything, but technologically speaking, infrastructure-wise, Istanbul was behind the other great cities of the world at that time. So now this brings us to CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress. CUP was led by a man named Mehmed Talat. Mehmed Talat, he had worked his way up from poverty to become the Minister of the Interior for the Ottoman Empire. But he was also a member of many secret societies, including the Freemasons. Yes, the Freemasons had made serious inroads into the Ottoman Empire, particularly in Salonika. And that's actually where Mehmed Talat worked. Talat mostly worked in Salonika, which is now in modern-day Greece, known as Thessalonica today. By this time it was called Salonika. Salonika was home to many secret organizations such as the Freemasons, such as the Committee for Union and Progress that Mehmed Talat was the leader of. At this point in time, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and he was what you would call an authoritarian. He was, in my opinion, an effective leader, a good leader, and I think he was sincere as far as protecting Islam and protecting his empire. But he was an authoritarian. Quite frankly, that's how most Muslim rulers have been throughout history. They've been authoritarian. And quite frankly, quite a number of democratic leaders have also been authoritarian, but that's a story for another day. So Abdul Hamid II, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, he forbade most forms of political activity within the Ottoman Empire. And obviously he would do that. He's not trying to turn his empire into a so-called democracy or republic or anything like that. In prior years, prior sultans had been forced to establish a constitution. Well, Sultan Abdul Hamid, he abolished the constitution and he disbanded parliament. He disbanded parliament and ruled the empire on his own. He had, of course, his ministers and his bureaucracy to help him, but he was the one calling the shots. Now, as you mentioned, there were lots of secret organizations. Istanbul was a very international city, so there's lots of communication and lots of traveling back and forth between Istanbul and the other parts of Europe. There are many young Ottomans, young Turks, young Muslims from the Ottoman Empire going to European nations to study, going to European universities and picking up all sorts of ideas, bringing them back into the empire. And now you have these young, European-educated Ottoman Muslims wanting to bring change to their nation. Now, of course, we can understand some of the desire for change because they see how far behind the Ottoman Empire was from the rest of Europe. You can imagine one of these young men going to study in Paris or London, and they see how advanced that city is for that era, of course, and then coming back to Istanbul, the capital, and the roads aren't even paved. And most people are still riding horses and carriages and stuff like that, whereas in London and Paris, they're driving cars. So you can see how they would want to believe that the reason why the Ottoman Empire was so far behind was because it hadn't adopted the European principles, the so-called European principles of republicanism, liberal government, and things like that. So you have lots of secret organizations, and we're going to get a lot more detail with this, inshallah, later on in the series. You have lots of these secret organizations thinking of ways to overthrow the government or bring change to the government. And we have Abdul Hamid II not wanting and not allowing any political activity. So you can see the conflict between these two groups. Unfortunately for the Ottoman Empire, that is, parts of the military had been infiltrated with members of these secret groups, particularly the military branch based in Salonika, where Mehmed Talat was based as well. In 1908, fighting broke out between CUP, that is the Committee for Union and Progress, and the government. And again, I promise, inshallah, more detail will be coming later on in the series. I can't do it all in this first episode. I'll give you more details on how all of this happened. But in 1908, fighting broke out between the Committee for Union and Progress and the government. As we mentioned, CUP, the Committee for Union and Progress, had infiltrated the military in Salonika. Most of the soldiers based in Salonika were members of CUP. If they weren't members, they at least sympathized with the members of CUP. And this allowed CUP, the Committee for Union and Progress, to fight against the government. Mehmed Talat, he used his membership. He was one of those guys who wanted to bring change to the government. And he was a member of all these weird secret organizations, including the Freemasons. Mehmed Talat wanted to use his membership in these various secret groups to mobilize his supporters in Salonika. And with his help, CUP was eventually able to take over Salonika from the government. CUP's success, the Committee for Union and Progress, its success eventually forced Abdul Hamid II to make changes. He was forced to restore the constitution. He was forced to bring back parliaments. And with this became global news. And all around the world, people began to call these young members of CUP, they began to call them Young Turks. These young Turks that had forced change upon the elderly, stubborn, authoritarian Ottoman Sultan. With parliament restored, the Young Turks, the members of CUP, they're now basically pulling the strings behind the scene. But remember, the members of CUP are military guys. Most of them are soldiers. They're not politicians. So they are not equipped, and they probably don't even want to necessarily run the government. They just want to protect the changes that they have brought to the government. And so the Young Turks are the power behind the politicians now running the government through parliament. Ironically, the British actually didn't like the Young Turks. The Young Turks' achievements in Istanbul were very big in the newspapers and in the press and in the public, but the governments that depended on the status quo did not like this sudden change. And many British actually thought that the Young Turks were actually run by Jews. This is the anti-Semitism within their own mind. They accuse us of that now, but in their mind, the British thought that CUP or the Young Turks was a Jewish conspiracy. As it turns out, however, these were mostly Muslims. The Young Turks were mostly Muslims. There were some Jewish members of the Young Turks or the Committee for Union and Progress, but for the most part, it was mostly Muslims. Many of them were Freemasons, but they were Muslim Freemasons. So now there is a theory that many of these Muslims were either Jews who converted to Islam or children of Jews who converted to Islam. And Allah knows best about that. But I have heard that theory put forth before. So with the British government not really being happy with this takeover from the Young Turks and actually thinking that Jews were behind the whole, I won't say overthrow of the Ottoman Sultan, but the minimizing or the taking power away from the Ottoman Sultan. So with the British thinking that it was Jews behind the whole Young Turk revolution that caused Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II to lose his power, not lose his throne, he lost his power. British decided that the best thing for them to do was try to make nice with the Jewish world, to show that they were friends of the Jews. And with that, an idea began to ripple through the corridors of the British government. Many people within the British government began to express their support for establishing a Jewish homeland, particularly in the Ottoman territory of Palestine. We mentioned how many of the people who were against Abdulhamid II, against the authoritarian style of the Ottoman Sultan, how many of them were students or former students or people who had studied in European universities and brought these ideas back to the Ottoman Empire. In addition to the ideas of liberalism and so-called democracy, republicanism, and all these things, in addition to all that, they also brought back something that was way more dangerous: nationalism. They went to these other nations and saw how nationalism was beginning to become a big thing in many parts of Europe, and many different groups of people who may have been subject by another group of people were starting to clamor for their independence and for their own nation, and to express the superiority of their ethnic group and their nation over others. And these Ottoman students brought that same ideology back into the Ottoman Empire. And now, as KUP was taking over, as the Young Turks were taking over, nationalism began to spread. Before this, the last thing the Ottoman Sultan wanted was nationalism. He ruled over an empire of many different ethnic groups. The last thing he wanted was nationalism. He didn't want a bunch of different ethnic groups talking about we deserve our own state and we deserve our own nation. That's the last thing he wanted. He wanted to bring unity. That's why he wanted unity, and that's why he stressed the importance of Islam, particularly Abdulhamid II. He stressed the importance of Islam as the unifying factor of the subjects of the Ottoman Empire. But now, with the Sultan being relegated to a figurehead status, the Young Turks running the government, they brought this nationalism, and they begin to discriminate against non-Turkish members, non-Turkish subjects of the Ottoman Empire, Arabs, Jews, Armenians, and others. So now the Young Turks have taken over the levers of government. They put their own people in roles of the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of War, the Governor of Constantinople, the Ministry of the Interior. All of these became politicians who were either members of the Young Turks or controlled by the Young Turks. And the Minister of the Interior was really the most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire. Now, even though Great Britain and other European powers were skeptical and nervous about the Young Turks takeover of the Ottoman government, they didn't realize that the Young Turks were actually very much divided themselves. They were also divided into many different factions and lots of infighting as well. But the Young Turks they understood that their empire was shrinking. And they were also afraid that the European powers might invade or just continue snatching away little pieces of the empire until it was dwindled down to nothing. So the Young Turks, who are now running the Ottoman government, they saw the need to free themselves from European influence and European economic dominance. I haven't explained how Europe dominated the Ottoman government's finances yet, but I'll get into more detail. But suffice it to say, the Ottoman Empire was in enormous debt to the European powers. The details will come, inshallah, later this series, but they were in enormous debt to the European powers, and because they were in such debt, Europeans basically took over the Ottoman financial system. So there's lots of things going on. Hopefully I can spell this out as the series goes on. You'll see, inshallah. But the Ottoman Empire was really crumbling. Not saying the Young Turks were right to do what they did to Abdulhamid II, but the empire was in trouble. So now the Young Turks, they need an ally. The British are not helping them. They're afraid of the French and especially the Russians trying to invade. That's when they decide to look for an ally, and so they turn to Germany. The Young Turks and the Ottoman governments, they know they need help. They see what's happening to their empire. They don't trust the Europeans, but they admire European technology and European advancements, and they know they need that if they if they stand a chance, if they want to have even a chance of surviving in this cutthroat world of geopolitics. Inshallah, we'll continue this in the next episode. But until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.